What if the Cold War never froze into a standoff at all, and instead continued moving west, one exhausted country at a time, until there was no Europe left to divide? And if that sounds extreme, the real question is this: what actually stopped it from happening in the first place? Let's step into a disturbing timeline where the Cold War never freezes, and Stalin's momentum quietly consumes Europe, one exhausted nation after another. To see how a Europe conquered by Joseph Stalin could be possible, we must abandon the comforting belief that he stopped expanding because he'd reached a natural endpoint or chose stability over conquest. So if Stalin was already willing to pay that price, what actually stopped him in real history? The common explanation is restraint or pragmatism, but that answer only works if we ignore the context of the moment. Europe in 1945 was physically shattered, economically drained, and psychologically exhausted. Entire cities were flattened. Infrastructure barely functioned. Populations were displaced, hungry, and traumatized. Meanwhile, the Red Army was already the largest and most battle-hardened force on the continent. Stalin didn't stop because it felt wrong. He stopped because the math stopped working. Specifically, the risk of triggering a response from powers that still had the capacity to escalate beyond his control, particularly a nuclear-armed United States. Now remove that constraint. Imagine a slightly altered post-war world where American political will fractures under domestic pressure, where Britain lacks the resources to project force, and where Stalin believes, correctly or not, that Western resistance would collapse under continued pressure rather than unify against him. Now, what happens when an expansionist system no longer believes resistance is guaranteed? By 1946, in this alternate timeline, Soviet forces did not consolidate. They advanced. France fell first, not through sudden invasion, but through political destabilization, military pressure, and the exhaustion of a population that has already survived occupation once. By 1947, Spain and Portugal followed. They were isolated and unsupported. And by 1948, Europe ceased to exist as a collection of independent states. From the Atlantic to the Urals, governance answers directly to Moscow. This is where the scenario becomes genuinely unsettling, because Stalin never sought control for prestige alone. He sought transformation. Europe would not simply be occupied, it would be re-engineered. Well, what does Stalin do with a continent once he owns it? He applies the same system he perfected inside the Soviet Union, at scale. And here's the thing: this system doesn't start with some grand ideology at all. It begins with fear. Forced labor camps begin popping up all across Europe. Security services, basically modeled after the NKVD, don't just exist in the background. They seep into everything: schools, workplaces, media, even private life. Surveillance isn't occasional anymore. It's constant, and worse, it's normalized. People stop questioning it because questioning feels dangerous. Trust? That concept just collapses. Neighbors don't trust neighbors. Friends don't trust friends. Everyone assumes they're being watched, and eventually, people learn the rule of survival. Safety doesn't come from being innocent. It comes from being invisible. London would not be governed as London. Paris would not be Paris. Rome, Vienna, Berlin, each city would lose its historical identity and become an administrative node inside a centralized system of control. Local governments would exist only as interfaces, staffed by loyalists whose authority flowed from Moscow rather than the population. So, who becomes dangerous in a system like that? Simple: anyone with influence. The first phase of Stalin's rule would focus on dismantling existing power structures. Military officers, aristocrats, political leaders, clergy, academics, artists, journalists, anyone capable of shaping thought or loyalty outside the state would be identified as a threat. Removal would not require proof. Suspicion would be enough. Language itself would shift. While local languages might survive in daily life, Russian would become the language of advancement, education, and authority. Power would speak Russian, and survival would require learning it. Then comes the economic transformation. Could Stalin's system actually work in Europe? At first, it might look like it does. Europe already possessed something the Soviet Union lacked: deep industrial expertise, advanced manufacturing capacity, and centuries of accumulated technical knowledge. Stalin would view this not as a challenge, but as raw material. 5-year plans would roll out across the continent. Factories would be nationalized. Workers would be assigned roles according to state priorities rather than personal ability or interest. Early output numbers might appear impressive, but the system itself would remain fundamentally broken. Stalin's economic system didn't run on innovation. It ran on coercion. Hitting targets mattered more than actually being efficient. Following orders mattered more than thinking creatively. And when production fell short, the response wasn't reform, it was punishment. Someone always had to pay. When agriculture started to collapse, the state didn't ease up. It seized more, harder, faster. Over time, scarcity stopped being an accident or a temporary crisis. It became baked into the system itself. Within a decade, Europe's standard of living would collapse. Rationing would become permanent. Consumer goods would vanish. Technological progress would slow as bureaucracy and ideological rigidity replaced experimentation. A continent that once led the world in science, philosophy, and culture would no longer move forward. It wouldn't evolve. It would simply remain frozen under centralized control. All right, think about this. What happens to culture under a system like this? And the answer was obvious. It didn't fade away by accident. It was removed systematically. Art would exist only to serve ideology. Literature would be required to reinforce loyalty. Music would need to reflect patriotic themes. Anything abstract, experimental, or critical would be condemned as decadent. Europe's great museums would be emptied or repurposed. Some works would be shipped to Moscow. Others would be destroyed. Universities would be converted into technical institutions focused solely on producing administrators and engineers loyal to the state. Intellectual inquiry would be replaced with ideological instruction. Religion would not survive either. Stalin viewed organized religion as a competing source of loyalty. Churches would be closed, repurposed, or dismantled. The Catholic Church would be broken apart. Protestant institutions neutralized. Jewish communities, who are already devastated, would face continued persecution. Spiritual life would be erased, not tolerated. Then come the purges. How large would repression need to be to control an entire continent? Unprecedented. With a population nearing 400 million, even a small percentage deemed politically unreliable would translate into tens of millions. Forced labor facilities would stretch across Europe. Surveillance networks would operate in every workplace, every school, every residential building. Informing would become a survival strategy. Silence would replace trust. Public trials would be staged as warnings. Confessions would be extracted. Removal would be normalized. Fear would become ambient, not episodic. Globally, the consequences would be catastrophic. Now, what happens when Stalin controls Europe's resources? The balance of power collapses. With Europe under Soviet control, the United States would face a far more dangerous reality than the Cold War we know. Without Western Europe as a counterweight, Soviet influence could expand into the Middle East, Africa, and global trade routes. Nuclear development, backed by continental resources, could accelerate. The risk of global catastrophe would increase dramatically. And Stalin's death would not bring relief. His successor would inherit not just a state, but a continental system built on fear, surveillance, and ideological rigidity. The machinery would persist, even if the man did not. This alternate history ultimately explains why Stalin stopped where he did in reality. He was not restrained by ethics. He was restrained by resistance. Remove that resistance, and nothing within his system would have prevented total expansion. A Europe conquered by Stalin would stand as a monument to unchecked power, where freedom was erased, culture dismantled, and human dignity subordinated entirely to ideology. And that's the real lesson here. Freedom is not inevitable. The world we live in was not guaranteed. It survived because ambition met resistance at a critical moment. Stalin's legacy is not that of a strategic genius, but of a warning. What happens when power exists without limits, oversight, or moral restraint?